David Martinez pushed the cleaning cart past the frosted glass doors of the 15th floor executive suite, the wheels squeaking against polished marble that reflected nothing but his own distorted shadow. 2 in the morning meant the building belonged to him, and the hum of industrial air conditioning, a kingdom of empty desks and dark monitors where no one would remember his face come sunrise. He'd worked this route for 2 years, every night the same loop through Roberts Tower's upper floors, and in all that time he'd perfected the art of being invisible. The cart held the usual arsenal: industrial-strength cleaner that smelled like fake lemons, microfiber rags folded into precise squares, a mop bucket he'd learned to push without letting the water slosh. His hands moved through the routine without thought, wiping down the conference table where executives had left coffee rings and scattered papers, emptying trash bins that revealed more about the company's inner workings than any memo ever could. Budget projections, client complaints, half-eaten lunches from restaurants he couldn't afford even if he worked double shifts. He was 35 years old and looked older in the bathroom mirror he cleaned every night, the fluorescent lights catching the gray creeping into his hairline. Black man, 5'11", broad shoulders that still carried the posture from 8 years in the Army, even if the uniform was long gone. The maintenance company issued him navy blue coveralls with his first name stitched over the pocket, no last name required for someone whose job was to disappear before the real employees arrived. The math of his life ran on a spreadsheet he kept in his head, numbers that never quite added up no matter how many times he recalculated. $2,100 a month, minus $850 for the 2-bedroom apartment in South Side, minus $400 for utilities and groceries if he bought the store brand everything, minus $385 every 6 weeks for Jordan's asthma medication when the prescription ran out. The insurance question was a blank cell in that spreadsheet, a zero that multiplied across every other calculation and left him 30 days from catastrophe at any given moment. Jordan was 8 years old and slept through his father's exits and entrances, the apartment dark when David left at 10:30 and still dark when he returned after 7. His son had learned to wake himself, make his own breakfast, pack his own lunch, operate in the gaps his father's schedule created. That self-sufficiency should have made David proud. Instead, it sat in his chest like a stone. The building knew secrets it kept from him. He'd mapped every inch during these midnight hours, learned which elevator stuck on the 9th floor, which supply closet still had good light bulbs, which office always left their window cracked even in winter. He knew the executive portraits that lined this hallway by heart. Elizabeth Roberts, Chief Executive Officer, her silver hair severe against a charcoal background, eyes that looked like they could calculate a quarterly earnings report while signing a termination notice. Richard Thompson, Vice President of Client Relations, the kind of polished that came from prep schools and country clubs David had only seen in movies. These people existed in a different Chicago than the one he rode the bus through every night. Their city had doorman and reservation-only restaurants and cars that cost more than he'd earned in 5 years. His city had check-cashing places with bulletproof glass and corner stores that sold loose cigarettes and landlords who wanted first, last, and security before you could even see the apartment. The building was where these two cities touched, without ever actually meeting. He finished the executive floor and took the freight elevator down to 8, where the real work started. Larger offices here, more trash, more evidence of the lives people lived while he wasn't watching. Someone's kid had drawn a picture taped to a cubicle wall, stick figures holding hands under a too bright sun. Someone else had a prescription bottle sitting out, the label turned away, but the shape unmistakable. David saw these fragments and built stories around them, populated the empty building with the people who'd return in 6 hours and never know he'd been there. The Army had taught him logistics, how to track supply chains worth $200 million across hostile territory, how to keep 3,000 soldiers fed and armed and moving when the infrastructure was actively trying to kill you. Iraq from 2008 to 2012, 4 deployments that compressed into a single sense memory of heat and dust and the particular alertness that came from knowing improvised explosives could turn a routine convoy into a casualty report. He'd been good at it, the kind of good that earned commendations and a promotion track that would have put him at major by now if he'd stayed in. But Sarah had been diagnosed in 2015, and the civilian job he'd found after separation suddenly seemed less important than the doctor appointments that multiplied across their calendar. Stage 3 breast cancer, then stage 4, then a series of treatment options that drained their savings faster than her strength. He'd quit the logistics coordinator position to become primary caregiver, spent 3 years learning a different kind of supply chain management, medications and meal prep, and the impossible calculus of hope versus prognosis. She died on a Tuesday in April 2021, late morning, sun coming through the hospice window in a way that seemed designed to make the moment worse. Jordan had been 6, too young to understand permanence, old enough to know something fundamental had broken. David had held his son in the hospital room and promised things he wasn't sure he could deliver. The kind of promises you make when the alternative is admitting you have no idea what comes next. The medical bills arrived with the sympathy cards, itemized proof that dying in America cost more than most people earned in a year. Even with the insurance from Sarah's nursing job, even with the payment plans and the hospital's financial assistance program, the debt swallowed everything. Bankruptcy came 8 months later, a legal acknowledgement that he'd lost a war he never had the weapons to fight. The logistics coordinator job was gone, filled during his caregiving years by someone with an unbroken employment history. He applied everywhere, but the resume gap opened questions he couldn't answer in a way that made hiring managers comfortable. Why 3 years out of the workforce? Family situation. What kind of situation? Personal medical matter. Can you elaborate? Not really, no. The maintenance position at Roberts Tower didn't require elaboration. They needed someone for the night shift. He needed money. The algebra was simple enough that nobody asked about the 8-year hole in his work history or what he'd been doing before he learned to operate an industrial floor buffer. He showed up on time, did the work without complaint, and collected a paycheck that kept Jordan fed even if it didn't keep them comfortable. The apartment they'd moved to after bankruptcy was smaller than the one they'd lost, a 5th-floor walk-up in a building where the elevator worked maybe half the time. Jordan's bedroom barely fit a twin bed and a dresser, walls thin enough that they could hear the couple next door arguing in Spanish about money and work and all the things people argued about when they were stuck in the same arithmetic David couldn't escape. His own room was even smaller, just enough space for a mattress and the plastic storage bins that held what remained of their previous life. The medicine cabinet in their bathroom was where hope went to die slowly. 2 inhalers sat on the middle shelf, one almost empty, the other already depleted. Jordan's asthma had worsened in the year since they'd moved, the apartment's mold problem triggering attacks that sent them to urgent care more often than David could afford. The inhaler cost $385 without insurance, a price that seemed designed to prove that breathing was a luxury reserved for people who'd made better choices. He'd learned to ration the medication, to talk Jordan through the early stages of an attack with breathing exercises and steam from the shower, to calculate whether this episode was serious enough to justify the emergency room copay they couldn't pay anyway. These were decisions no parent should have to make, but the healthcare system didn't care about should, only about did you have coverage or didn't you. Thursday night bled into Friday morning the way it always did, the hours marked by floors cleaned and trash removed rather than any clock. David finished the 8th-floor offices and moved to the corridors, mopping the long stretches of tile that connected departments to break rooms to elevator banks. The work had a rhythm that let his mind drift, problem-solving the next day's logistics. Jordan needed new shoes, the sole separating on the left one. The electric bill was due Monday. The bus pass expired in a week. He was thinking about the shoes when he heard the sound from the east corridor. Not a crash, nothing dramatic, just a heavy thump, like something substantial hitting the floor, followed by a scraping noise that didn't belong in the building's usual ambient hum. David stopped pushing the mop bucket and listened, trying to place the direction. The corridor split ahead, one branch leading to the emergency stairwell, the other to the storage rooms where the building kept its extra furniture and outdated equipment. Another sound, a low groan, distinctly human, distinctly distressed. David left the cart and walked toward the noise, his boots silent on the still wet floor. The east corridor opened into a wider space where the building's HVAC systems created a constant background rumble, and there, slumped against the wall beneath a flickering fluorescent tube, was Robert Harris. The security guard was 64 years old, black man gone gray, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked this building longer than David had been alive. They'd developed a quiet friendship over the past 2 years, the kind built on 3 a.m. coffee breaks and shared understanding that came from both having served. Robert sat with his back against the wall now, legs splayed out, one hand clutching his chest while the other braced against the floor. David dropped to his knees beside him. Robert's face had gone the wrong color, a grayish pallor that cut through his dark complexion, sweat beading on his forehead despite the building's relentless air conditioning. "Robert, can you hear me?" The older man's eyes focused slowly, recognition swimming up through obvious pain. His voice came out tight, every word an effort. "Chest, can't catch." David's training kicked in before conscious thought caught up. 8 years of Army crisis response protocols activating like muscle memory. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed 911. Keeping his other hand on Robert's shoulder, pressure meant to ground rather than restrain. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. David's voice came out calm, information delivered in the clipped cadence he'd used for casualty reports. "Medical emergency at Roberts Tower, 500 North Michigan Avenue, 8th floor East Corridor. Male, 64, possible cardiac event. Conscious but in severe distress. We need paramedics now." The dispatcher asked questions. David answered them while simultaneously loosening Robert's collar, checking his pulse at the neck, watching the rhythm of his breathing. 60 beats per minute, shallow but steady, skin clammy, pupils responsive but sluggish. Every observation got relayed to the dispatcher while another part of his mind calculated response times, wondered if the building's defibrillator was accessible after hours, mapped the fastest route for emergency personnel from street level to this corridor. "Stay with me, Robert." David kept his voice low, the tone he'd used with wounded soldiers who needed to hear certainty even when the situation offered none. "Help's coming. 2 minutes, maybe 3. Just breathe. Nice and slow. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You remember this from basic? 4 count in, 6 count out. With me now." Robert tried to follow the breathing pattern, each inhale a visible struggle. His hand found David's forearm and gripped it, not asking permission, just needing the contact. David let him hold on and kept talking, a steady stream of reassurance and instruction that filled the space between them and kept panic from taking over. "Paramedics are already rolling. Best crew in the city, probably somebody you know from the old days. They're going to get you sorted, check everything, make sure this is just your body's way of saying you worked too hard." Sarah's brother had something like this. They had him at Northwestern for about 6 hours, ran every test they could think of, sent him home with a lecture about sodium intake. "You'll be giving me grief about this next week." He didn't believe his own reassurance, but belief wasn't the point. The point was keeping Robert conscious and calm until professionals with better equipment could take over. Time stretched in the particular way it did during emergencies, each second loaded with hyper-awareness while the overall span became impossible to track. David stayed in the present, monitoring Robert's breathing, watching for any change that might indicate deterioration. "Jordan asked about you last week. Wanted to know if you really jumped out of helicopters in Vietnam. I told him you were a door gunner, which is somehow even more terrifying to an 8-year-old. He drew you a picture. I keep forgetting to bring it in. Helicopter with a guy hanging out the side, shooting at nothing in particular. Very abstract, very avant-garde." Robert's grip loosened slightly. Not unconsciousness, but the kind of relaxation that suggested the immediate panic was ebbing. His breathing evened out into something closer to a sustainable rhythm. David checked his watch. 4 minutes since the call. Paramedics should be on site any moment. "That's it. Steady. You're doing fine. Everything's fine." The elevator chimed in the distance, followed by the rapid footsteps of people moving with purpose. 2 paramedics rounded the corner carrying equipment, a woman and a younger man, both moving with the efficient urgency of professionals who knew every second counted, but rushing helped no one. David gave them space immediately, standing and stepping back while delivering the relevant information: timeline, symptoms, current status. The woman asked if he'd administered anything. He said no, just kept him calm and breathing. She nodded, already focused on Robert, running through her own assessment with practiced speed. The younger paramedic looked at David with something approaching respect. "You military?" "Army. Logistics. Shows." He turned back to Robert, helping his partner get the older man onto a portable gurney. "Good work keeping him stable." They had Robert loaded and moving toward the elevator within 3 minutes, the woman calling ahead to Northwestern Memorial while her partner maintained constant monitoring of vitals. David followed them as far as the elevator, then stopped, letting them go ahead. The doors closed on Robert, giving him a weak thumbs up, the gesture more reflex than genuine optimism. The corridor returned to its usual emptiness, the only evidence of the past 20 minutes some scuff marks on the floor where the gurney had pivoted. David stood there longer than necessary, adrenaline slowly draining from his system and leaving the familiar exhaustion that always followed crisis response. His hands were steady, his breathing normal, his mind already filing the incident into that category of things you did because they needed doing, and thinking too hard about it later served no purpose. He went back to his cleaning cart and finished the 8th floor, mopping over the scuff marks until they disappeared. The routine swallowed the disruption, order reasserting itself over chaos the way it always did if you just kept working. What David couldn't know, was that Elizabeth Roberts had been in the operations office on the 15th floor when the call came through building security about the medical emergency. She'd pulled up the camera feeds, watched the entire scene unfold in real-time surveillance footage that captured David's calm response, his competent crisis management, the way he'd stayed with Robert without hesitation or dramatics. She'd watched him talk the older man through breathing exercises, watched him relay information to paramedics with military precision, watched him step back and let the professionals work without needing recognition or thanks. She'd opened the building's employee database and found his name in the maintenance roster. Martinez, David. Night shift. 2 years tenure. Before closing the file, she'd made a note in her personal calendar for Monday morning. Review maintenance staff backgrounds. David finished his shift at 7, the building slowly coming alive around him as the first office workers arrived. He took the freight elevator down to the service level, clocked out, changed from his coveralls into the jeans and jacket he'd worn on the bus ride in. The morning supervisor, a perpetually tired woman named Gloria, nodded at him on his way out. "Harris all right?" Word traveled fast even in a building this size. "Paramedics got him. Should be fine." "Good work." She said it without looking up from her clipboard, already focused on the day shift assignments. The bus ride home took 40 minutes through a city slowly shaking off night, and David spent it staring out the window at neighborhoods that shifted from commercial to residential to the particular liminal spaces that belonged to neither. He got off 3 blocks from his apartment and walked the rest, checking his phone out of habit even though nobody ever called him this early. The apartment building's elevator was broken again, the handwritten out-of-order sign taped to the doors in what he suspected was permanent marker. He took the stairs, legs complaining after 9 hours on his feet, and let himself into 5C as quietly as possible, even though Jordan was definitely awake by now. His son sat at the kitchen table, 8 years old and small for his age, wearing pajamas decorated with planets and eating cereal from a bowl he'd filled himself. The homework from last night lay finished beside him, neat printing that showed the same careful attention David remembered from his own childhood. Jordan looked up when his father entered and smiled, the expression transforming his face into something that made David's chest hurt. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, buddy." David set his keys on the counter and moved to the coffee maker, muscle memory guiding him through the routine. "You sleep okay?" "Yeah. Had a dream about dinosaurs. They were driving cars. Makes sense. Dinosaurs need to get around too." He watched Jordan eat while the coffee brewed, cataloging the small details that shifted day to day. The kid's hair needed cutting, getting long enough to fall in his eyes. The pajamas were getting tight around the wrists, growth happening whether or not the budget had room for new clothes. Jordan coughed once, a small thing, barely noticeable. but David's attention sharpened immediately. "You feeling all right?" "I'm fine." Jordan said it with the particular emphasis kids used when they knew their parents were looking for problems. "Just breakfast went down wrong." David opened the medicine cabinet in the bathroom and stared at the two inhalers, doing math he'd done too many times already. The fuller one had maybe a week left. The empty one was already useless. $385 for the replacement, $47 in his checking account until next Friday's direct deposit. The numbers didn't work, wouldn't work, would never work, no matter how many times he rearranged them. He closed the cabinet and went back to the kitchen. Jordan had moved to the sink, rinsing his bowl with the careful thoroughness of a child who'd been taught to clean up after himself. 8 years old, and already learning the lessons of scarcity, already understanding that things cost money they didn't have, and problems needed to be managed rather than solved. "Dad?" Jordan turned from the sink, water still running behind him. "Mrs. Chen said she can pick me up from school today if you need to sleep." Mrs. Chen was their neighbor, a widow in her 70s who'd appointed herself Jordan's unofficial grandmother. She watched him some afternoons when David's schedule didn't allow for school pickup, never asking for money because she seemed to understand they didn't have it to spare. "That's okay, buddy. I'll get you. But you look tired." David managed something approximating a smile. "I'm all right. Go get dressed. Bus comes in 20 minutes. Jordan nodded and disappeared into his bedroom, leaving David alone with the coffee and the persistent arithmetic of survival. He'd get maybe 4 hours of sleep before he needed to be up for school pickup. Then Jordan would do homework while David made dinner from whatever they had left in the refrigerator. Then he'd try to sleep again before the next shift started. The cycle repeated daily, a hamster wheel he couldn't step off without everything collapsing. The apartment felt smaller every day, walls closing in with the weight of everything he couldn't fix. Sarah's pictures still hung in the hallway, smiling from a time when they'd believed in futures that extended past the next month's rent. Looking at them hurt, so David had stopped looking. But their presence remained, a reminder of what he'd failed to protect. Jordan emerged dressed for school, backpack already loaded, jacket in hand, even though the April morning was warm enough to skip it. The kid's self-sufficiency should have been admirable. Instead, it felt like evidence of David's inadequacy, proof that he'd created a child who expected nothing because experience had taught him expecting anything led to disappointment. They walked to the bus stop together, David carrying Jordan's backpack because it was the one small thing he could do. Other kids waited with their parents, whole families in various configurations, and David found himself cataloging the differences. Who had 2 parents, who drove their own cars, who wore clothes that didn't come from goodwill. Jordan didn't seem to notice or care, just stood beside his father and talked about the science project due next week and whether dinosaurs were cooler than sharks. The bus arrived, bright yellow and loud, and Jordan climbed aboard with the same casual goodbye he gave every morning. David watched until the bus turned the corner, then walked back to the apartment alone. 4 hours of sleep passed in what felt like 20 minutes, his alarm dragging him back to consciousness with the familiar sense of not having rested at all. He went through the motions: shower, coffee, checked the mail where nothing but bills waited. The electric company wanted their money. The phone company wanted their money. The hospital wanted money he'd never be able to pay them. He filed the envelopes unopened in the kitchen drawer where they joined the others, a growing archive of debt he'd stopped pretending to address. School pickup at 3:15 meant leaving the apartment at 2:40, another bus ride through the city, another wait outside the elementary school while other parents arrived in their cars and talked about things David couldn't relate to. Jordan came out with the other second graders, spotted his father immediately, and his face did that transformation again, the smile that made everything almost worth it. They rode the bus home together, Jordan narrating his day and the particular detail children used when they needed to fill silence. Who sat with who at lunch, what happened during recess, how the substitute teacher didn't know where anything was. David listened and asked questions and tried to be present even though exhaustion pulled at him like an undertow. Back at the apartment, Jordan spread his homework across the kitchen table while David checked what they had for dinner. The refrigerator offered limited options: eggs, some wilted vegetables, cheese that was approaching its expiration date. He could make scrambled eggs work, maybe with toast, something filling enough that Jordan wouldn't go to bed hungry even if it wasn't exactly nutritious. The mail he'd ignored earlier sat on the counter, and he flipped through it with half his attention while the eggs cooked. Bill. Credit card offer he'd never qualify for. And then something different. A single sheet of paper, standard printer stock, that hadn't been in the mailbox at all. He must have brought it in without noticing, scooped up from wherever he'd set his keys. The paper had text printed in standard corporate formatting, the kind that came from HR departments everywhere. He almost threw it away without reading, assumed it was something left in the building that had stuck to his jacket. But 2 words at the top made him stop. Health insurance. David stood at the counter and read the full page, his eggs slowly overcooking on the stove behind him. Internal job posting. Position: Client Relations. Specialist Department: Client Services. Richard Thompson, VP. Salary range: $58,000 to $65,000 annually. Benefits: full health insurance, medical, dental, vision, 401k matching, 3 weeks. PTO requirements: bachelor's degree preferred, 3+ years, customer service or client-facing experience, strong communication skills, ability to manage multiple priorities. Application. Deadline: 7 days from posting date. He read it again, then a third time, slower, making sure the words actually said what he thought they said. $58,000 a year. Health insurance. Full coverage. Jordan's inhaler would cost $15 instead of $385. Doctor visits would be co-pays instead of catastrophes. The medicine cabinet wouldn't be a source of nightly anxiety, but just a cabinet. The smoke detector went off, pulling him back to the present. His eggs had burned, the pan smoking on the burner. He yanked it off the heat and opened the window, waving away the smoke while Jordan looked up from his homework with mild concern. "You okay, Dad?" "Fine. Just got distracted." He scraped the ruined eggs into the trash and started over, hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind raced ahead. He didn't have a bachelor's degree. He'd done 2 years at community college before enlisting, took a few more classes during his Army career, but never finished. The job posting said preferred, not required, which meant maybe, possibly, they'd consider someone without it. 3 years client-facing experience. Did Army logistics count? He'd managed relationships with contractors, coordinated with local nationals, briefed superior officers. That was client-facing, just with different stakes. And the 2 years at Roberts Tower, even if it was maintenance, showed stability, reliability, understanding of how the company operated. The application deadline was in a week. 7 days to decide if he was willing to try for something this far outside his current reality. 7 days to convince himself that the gap between night janitor and salaried professional wasn't actually insurmountable. He made new eggs, served them to Jordan with toast, and sat across from his son at the table they'd gotten from the curb when they first moved in. The job posting lay folded in his pocket, the paper warm against his leg, a possibility he wasn't ready to speak out loud yet. Jordan ate and talked about his science project, something about the water cycle, and David nodded and asked appropriate questions while a different part of his brain ran probability calculations. What were the odds they'd even interview him? What were the odds he'd get past the first round if they did? What were the odds this whole thing was anything other than setting himself up for a rejection that would confirm what he already suspected? People like him didn't get jobs like that. After dinner, Jordan went to his room to work on the science project, cutting careful shapes from construction paper. David cleaned the dishes and stared at the closed medicine cabinet and thought about insurance cards and co-pays and a life where breathing wasn't rationed by financial desperation. He went to his room, the space barely large enough to turn around in, and opened the closet. The funeral suit hung in the back, still in the plastic garment bag from the dry cleaner. He'd bought it for Sarah's service, wore it exactly once, couldn't bring himself to get rid of it even though looking at it brought back that particular April morning in high definition. The suit was black, conservative, the kind of thing people wore to job interviews. It would still fit. Probably. He didn't take it out to check. David sat on his mattress and pulled out his phone, opened a browser, searched Client Relations Specialist interview questions. The results offered hundreds of articles, all of them assuming the reader belonged to a world he'd only ever observed from the outside. How to showcase your achievements. How to negotiate salary. How to make a memorable impression. The language felt foreign, designed for people who'd never had to choose between medication and rent. But he read anyway, absorbing information the way he'd absorbed tactical briefings, building a mental database of what this kind of job required and how someone might convince an interview panel they could deliver it. By the time Jordan knocked on his door at 8:30 to say goodnight, David had filled a notebook with potential answers, researched Roberts Global's client base, and started to construct something that might, generously, be called a plan. Jordan stood in the doorway in his Planet pajamas, hair still damp from his bath. "Dad, you're not going to work tonight?" David checked the time, 9:15. He needed to leave in an hour. "I am, just doing some reading first." "Reading what?" "Work stuff. Boring adult things." Jordan nodded, accepting this the way he accepted everything, and crossed the small room to hug his father goodnight. David held on longer than usual, feeling the kid's breathing against his chest, steady and clear for now, the inhaler working well enough that tomorrow wasn't an emergency yet. "Love you, buddy." "Love you too, Dad." Jordan pulled back and studied his father's face with the particular scrutiny children used when they sensed something had changed. "Are you okay?" "I'm good. Just tired." "You're always tired." "Comes with the job." Jordan seemed to accept this, or at least decided not to push further. He padded back to his room, and David heard the door close, heard the bed creak as his son climbed under covers. The apartment settled into its nightly quiet, just the ambient sounds of other lives happening in other units, the building creaking with the weight of everyone inside it trying to make it to morning. David sat on his mattress and pulled the job posting from his pocket, unfolded it, read it one more time. The deadline was 7 days out. The smart move was probably to throw it away, except that some opportunities existed in theory, but not for people in his situation. The smart move was to keep his head down, work his shift, maintain the stability he'd managed to build, even if it felt more like barely controlled drowning. He thought about Jordan asking if he was okay, thought about the kid being 8 years old and already understanding that his father was always tired, already accepting that as the normal state of things. Thought about the medicine cabinet and the math that never worked, and the particular desperation of watching your child struggle to breathe while you calculated whether the emergency room was worth the bill you couldn't pay. He pulled out his laptop, the one he'd bought used 3 years ago and kept running through sheer stubbornness and YouTube repair videos. The screen took a moment to wake up, pixels slowly resolving into the desktop background Jordan had chosen. A picture of them at Navy Pier from before Sarah got sick, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. David opened a browser and navigated to Roberts Global's internal job portal, the one he'd never accessed because maintenance staff didn't need to. He created an account using his employee ID, filled in the basic information, and stared at the application form with its empty fields waiting to be populated with a history that didn't quite fit the boxes provided. Employment history, education, skills, references. Each section demanded a story he wasn't sure how to tell in a way that made him sound like someone who belonged in client relations, rather than someone who cleaned the offices after everyone else went home. He started typing anyway, choosing his words carefully, framing his experience in language the system might recognize. Army logistics officer became supply chain coordinator with emphasis on client relationship management. The caregiving years became family medical situation requiring temporary career pause. The 2 years as maintenance staff became comprehensive understanding of Roberts' global operations and culture. It wasn't lying exactly, just translation, converting his actual life into the dialect spoken by people who made hiring decisions. He finished the application at 4 in the morning, proofread it twice, and hovered his cursor over the submit button. This was the moment to quit, to close the laptop, and accept that some bridges were too far to cross. This was where practical people cut their losses and stuck with what they knew. David thought about Jordan's letter, the one he'd just discovered under the laptop. A piece of notebook paper folded carefully, his son's handwriting looping across the lines in that particular combination of careful and chaotic that came from being 8. "Dad, I know you miss Mom. I miss her too. But you're still the best dad. If you want to try something new, I believe you can do it. Love, Jordan." Below the text, a drawing of a man in a suit, a smaller figure holding his hand, both of them rendered in the abstract style of childhood where love mattered more than proportion. David read the note twice, his chest doing something complicated, and clicked submit before he could talk himself out of it. The screen confirmed his application had been received, gave him a reference number, told him he'd hear back within 5 business days. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark room, listening to Jordan sleep in the next room, listening to the buildings settle around them, listening to the quiet voice in his head that said he'd just done something either brave or stupid, and wouldn't know which until someone else decided for him. The shift at Roberts Tower started in 6 hours. He needed to shower, needed to get his coveralls ready, needed to catch the bus that would take him back to the building where he'd just applied for a job that might as well have been on another planet for all the distance between his current life and the one that posting described. But for now, in the dark before dawn, David Martinez let himself imagine what it might feel like to walk through the front doors instead of the service entrance, to ride the main elevator instead of freight, to be someone people looked at instead of someone they looked through. The image didn't hold, reality crowding back in with all its practical concerns and mathematical impossibilities. Still, he'd submitted the application. The thing was done, irreversible, already somewhere in a system that would either open a door or confirm it had been locked all along. He thought about the medicine cabinet, about Jordan's breathing, about the distance between $385 and $15, and let that calculation settle into something that might, if he squinted, look like hope. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. The email arrived on Tuesday morning while David was trying to sleep, his phone buzzing on the nightstand with the particular insistence that meant someone wanted his attention immediately. He'd been home from his shift for maybe 3 hours, the kind of shallow rest where consciousness kept threatening to pull him back up. The phone won. Linda Taylor, Human Resources Coordinator, Roberts Global Enterprises. Subject line, interview scheduled, client relations specialist position. He read it sitting up in bed, exhaustion making the words harder to parse than they should have been. Thursday morning, 9 o'clock, 7th floor conference room. Please bring valid identification and additional copies of your resume. Business attire required. The email didn't waste words on encouragement or context, just delivered the logistical facts and assumed he'd figure out the rest. David stared at the screen until it dimmed, then read the message again to make sure he hadn't hallucinated it during the brief window between sleep and waking. Thursday, 2 days away. Business attire in a closet that contained exactly one suit, the black one he'd worn to bury his wife, the fabric still holding the memory of that particular morning in a way he couldn't quite articulate but felt every time he looked at it. He got out of bed because sleeping was impossible now, adrenaline cutting through the fatigue and leaving him wired in the particular way that came from knowing something significant was about to happen. The apartment was quiet, Jordan already at school, Mrs. Chen having done pickup this morning when David's shift ran late. The silence pressed against him, creating space for thoughts he'd been successfully avoiding for the past 72 hours. What made him think he could pull this off? Night janitor to client relations specialist wasn't a career progression, it was a fantasy. The kind of thing that happened in movies where hard work and determination automatically translated to success. Real life operated on different mathematics, and David knew exactly what his variables looked like on paper. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, searching for interview advice with the focused intensity of someone preparing for combat. The internet offered thousands of articles. each one assuming a baseline of professional experience he didn't possess. How to discuss your greatest weakness. How to explain career transitions. How to demonstrate leadership in client-facing situations. David took notes, building a framework of answers that borrowed from his Army experience and tried to translate maintenance work into language that sounded relevant. He'd managed relationships with contractors in Iraq, coordinated logistics across hostile territory, briefed officers who needed clear information under pressure. That was client relations, just with different stakes and vocabulary. The employment gap still gaped like a wound, impossible to hide or minimize. 3 years out of the workforce to care for Sarah, then 2 years in a position that had nothing to do with the job he was applying for. The gap existed, indelible on his resume, and no amount of careful phrasing could erase it. He worked through potential questions until his notes filled 6 pages, then practiced answers out loud in the empty apartment, hearing how they sounded when spoken rather than just thought. The words came out stiff at first, rehearsed in a way that would read as dishonest. He softened them, found the balance between preparation and authenticity, told himself that honesty was the only strategy he had anyway. Wednesday passed in a blur of preparation that felt simultaneously productive and futile. He researched Roberts Global's client base, memorized the names of their major accounts, studied the company's public statements about growth and expansion. The information accumulated in his head like ammunition he might need but couldn't predict when to deploy. Jordan noticed something had shifted, the kid's emotional radar picking up on his father's unusual energy. They sat at dinner Wednesday night, spaghetti from a box with sauce from a jar, and Jordan watched him with the particular scrutiny children used when adults were acting strange. "Dad, are you okay? You seem different." "I'm fine, buddy. Just got a lot on my mind." "Work stuff?" "Sort of." David twirled spaghetti around his fork without eating it, trying to figure out how much to explain. "I have a meeting tomorrow. An important one." "Like a job interview?" Kids were terrifyingly perceptive when you least wanted them to be. "Yeah, like that." Jordan absorbed this information while chewing, his face cycling through emotions too complex for an 8-year-old to fully process. "Are you going to stop being a janitor?" The question landed harder than it should have. "I don't know yet. Maybe. If things go well." "Would that be good?" David set down his fork and looked at his son, really looked at him. "Would you want that?" Jordan shrugged, the gesture containing more weight than the casual movement suggested. "I don't care what job you have, you're still my dad." Something in David's chest cracked open slightly, the protective numbness he'd built over 2 years shifting enough to let feeling through. "I know, buddy. But some jobs are better than others. Pay more, have better hours. I could be home more." "That would be good." Jordan said it simply, without manipulation or performance, just stating a fact about what he wanted from the world. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and afterward Jordan disappeared into his room to work on homework, while David stood in front of his closet and stared at the funeral suit still in its garment bag. He needed to try it on, make sure it still fit, but the prospect felt like tempting fate in a way he couldn't quite rationalize. The bag crinkled as he unzipped it, the sound loud in the small bedroom. The suit looked exactly as he remembered. Black, conservative, the kind of thing that could pass for professional without being remarkable. He'd bought it 2 days before Sarah's service at a Men's Warehouse having a sale, the salesperson reading the situation correctly and skipping the usual upsell routine. David pulled it out and laid it on the bed, then stripped down to his underwear and tried on the pants first. They fit, maybe a little looser than before, because stress and irregular meals had carved away whatever extra weight he'd carried 2 years ago. The jacket went on next, shoulders settling into place, sleeves hitting at the right point above his wrists. He stood in front of the small mirror attached to his closet door and studied his reflection. Black suit, white undershirt because he didn't own dress shirts anymore, bare feet because the dress shoes were somewhere in the back of the closet and he wasn't ready to find them yet. The man looking back at him seemed like someone playing dress-up, a janitor in borrowed clothes pretending to be someone he wasn't. The knock on his door came soft but insistent. Jordan stood in the doorway when David opened it, the kid's eyes widening as he took in the suit. "Whoa, Dad, you look ridiculous?" "No, you look like a boss." Jordan said it with absolute conviction, the kind only children possessed, unfiltered belief that what they saw was real regardless of context. David felt something uncomfortable happening behind his eyes, the pressure that preceded tears he couldn't afford to shed in front of his son. "Thanks, buddy. Do you need help with your tie?" "I don't have a—" David stopped, realizing Jordan was right. He'd forgotten about the tie completely, and Men's Warehouse hadn't included one with the suit purchase. "Actually, yeah, I'll need to get one tomorrow." Jordan's face did something complicated, a mix of disappointment and determination. "Wait here." The kid disappeared back into his room, leaving David standing in the doorway wondering what just happened. Jordan returned 30 seconds later holding his tablet, the screen already open to a YouTube video titled "How to Tie a Necktie. Easy Tutorial for Beginners." "I found this yesterday. I can learn it and help you in the morning." David looked at his 8-year-old son offering to teach himself a skill overnight just to help with a job interview, and felt the protective numbness crack a little wider. "Jordan, you don't have to—" "I want to." The kid's voice carried steel underneath the higher pitch, determination that didn't accept argument. "You need a tie, and I can help. That's what we do." There wasn't a counter-argument that didn't involve explaining things Jordan was too young to carry, so David nodded and let his son disappear back into his room with the tablet, the voice from the video already explaining the difference between a four-in-hand and a Windsor knot. David changed back into regular clothes and finished his evening routine on autopilot, the looming interview consuming all available processing power. He went to bed early, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, and lay in the dark running through potential questions and answers until the words lost meaning. Thursday morning arrived with the particular weight of days that would be remembered regardless of outcome. David woke to his alarm at 6:30, earlier than necessary but unable to sleep any longer. He showered with deliberate care, shaved with a razor he'd replaced for the occasion, tried to make himself look like someone who belonged in a 7th-floor conference room rather than a service corridor. Jordan was already awake when David emerged from the bathroom, the kid sitting at the kitchen table with a tie laid out in front of him and the tablet propped against a cereal box. The video paused on a close-up of hands demonstrating the Windsor knot. "I practiced on my bedpost last night. I think I got it." David poured coffee and watched his son manipulate the tie with careful concentration, the movements slow but increasingly confident. Jordan had chosen a tie from somewhere, and David realized with a start that it was one of his old ones from before Sarah got sick, back when he'd worked the logistics coordinator job and needed professional clothes regularly. "Where did you find that?" "Bottom of your closet, in a box." Jordan didn't look up, focused entirely on the knot formation. "Is it okay?" "It's perfect, buddy." The tie was navy blue with thin diagonal stripes, conservative enough to be safe, interesting enough to not be boring. David had no memory of buying it, but it must have survived the various purges that came with downsizing and bankruptcy. Jordan finished his practice run and looked up, face bright with accomplishment. "Okay, I'm ready. Put on your suit." David obeyed, feeling like the roles had somehow reversed. His 8-year-old suddenly the competent adult, while he became the child needing guidance. The suit went on easier than yesterday, muscle memory kicking in, and he stood in the kitchen while Jordan dragged a chair over and climbed up to reach his father's collar. The kid's hands were small and uncertain, fingers fumbling with the tie as he tried to replicate what the video had shown him. David stood perfectly still, barely breathing, letting Jordan work through the problem without interference. The first attempt failed, the knot coming out lopsided. Jordan frowned and started over, his face set in concentration that aged him beyond his years. The second attempt worked better, the knot forming properly even if it sat slightly crooked. Jordan adjusted it with careful fingers, then stepped back to assess his work with critical eyes. "There. Now you look like a real boss, Dad." David checked his reflection in the window, seeing a man in a black suit and navy tie who almost looked like he belonged in professional spaces. Almost. The illusion held if you didn't look too closely, didn't notice the shoes that were good but old, the shirt that was technically white but had gone slightly gray from too many washings, the haircut he'd given himself with clippers in the bathroom mirror. "Thanks, buddy. I couldn't have done this without you." Jordan climbed down from the chair and hugged his father with the fierce intensity kids used when they understood something important was happening but couldn't quite articulate what. David held on, feeling his son's breathing against his chest, steady and clear for now, the inhaler doing its job for another day. "You're going to do great." Jordan set it into his father's jacket, voice muffled but certain. "I hope so." "I know so. You're the smartest dad." Mrs. Chen arrived at 7:30 to walk Jordan to school, the arrangement made yesterday when David explained he had an early meeting. The older woman took one look at him in the suit and smiled with the kind of warmth that suggested she understood more than he'd told her. "Good luck today, David." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I appreciate you doing this." "It's nothing. Jordan is good company." She took the kid's hand and headed for the door, then paused. "You know, my husband once applied for a job everyone said he'd never get. Too old, too inexperienced, wrong background. He got it anyway. Sometimes people surprise you." The door closed behind them, leaving David alone with 30 minutes before he needed to leave. He made himself eat breakfast even though his stomach protested, forced down toast and coffee while reviewing his notes one final time. The preparation felt inadequate and excessive simultaneously, too much research for a job he probably wouldn't get, not nearly enough to overcome the fundamental gaps in his qualifications. The bus ride downtown happened in a fog of anxiety, David staring out the window without registering the passing neighborhoods. Other passengers scrolled through phones or slept or stared into the middle distance with the glazed expression of people enduring their commute. None of them knew he was heading towards something that could change everything or confirm nothing would ever change. Roberts Tower appeared through the bus window, glass and steel rising into a cloudless morning, the building where he'd spent 2 years being invisible now demanding he be seen. David got off at his usual stop and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the structure with different eyes. The service entrance was around the corner, the familiar route to the freight elevator and the maintenance supervisor's office. But today required the front doors, the main lobby, the world he'd observed without participating. He checked his phone. 8:45. 15 minutes early, the sweet spot between punctual and desperate. David crossed Michigan Avenue with a cluster of other pedestrians and approached the entrance he'd only used once before, the day he'd come in for initial hiring paperwork with the maintenance company. The lobby opened up in glass and marble, designed to impress visitors and remind employees they worked somewhere important. A security desk dominated the center, manned by a guard David didn't recognize, someone from the day shift he'd never crossed paths with. Other people moved through the space with purpose, suits and dresses, and the particular confidence that came from belonging. David walked toward the security desk, each step feeling like a small act of transgression, waiting for someone to stop him and ask what he thought he was doing. The guard looked up as he approached, his expression moving from neutral to slightly suspicious in the way security personnel assessed unexpected variables. "Can I help you?" "I have a 9 o'clock interview, 7th floor." The guard's eyes traveled from David's face to his suit to his shoes and back, the assessment quick but thorough. "Name?" "David Martinez." Fingers clicked on a keyboard, eyes scanning a screen David couldn't see. The pause stretched long enough to suggest a problem, and David prepared himself for the revelation that his name wasn't on any list, that the email had been a mistake or a cruel prank. "Oh, yeah, okay." The guard's tone shifted slightly, surprise bleeding through professional neutrality. 7th floor, elevator bank on your right. They'll direct you from reception." The "you're cleared to proceed" felt weighted with something David couldn't quite identify, something that suggested the guard hadn't expected to find his name on that list. David nodded his thanks and moved toward the elevators, hyper-aware of his own body in this space, convinced everyone could tell he didn't belong. The elevator bank served floors 1 through 15, the cars themselves large enough to accommodate a dozen people comfortably. David stepped into an empty one and pressed 7, watching the doors slide closed and seal him into the ascending box. His reflection appeared in the polished doors, distorted but recognizable. Black man, 35, wearing a suit that fit but felt foreign, carrying a folder with extra resume copies and identification. The elevator rose smoothly, digital numbers marking the progression. Floor 3, floor 5, floor 7, the chime soft and precise. The doors opened onto a corridor David had mopped countless times but never entered through the main elevator. The floor looked different from this angle, less like a space he serviced and more like a place where actual work happened. A reception desk sat 20 feet ahead, a young woman behind it managing phones and a computer with practiced efficiency. She looked up as David approached, her professional smile activating automatically. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I have a 9 o'clock interview. David Martinez." She checked her computer, found whatever she was looking for, and her smile warmed fractionally. "Yes, Mr. Martinez. You're right on time. If you'll have a seat in the waiting area, someone will come for you shortly." She gestured toward a small seating area down the hall, 2 chairs and a low table with magazines David suspected no one actually read. He thanked her and walked to the designated space, choosing the chair that let him see both the elevator and the corridor, military habit putting his back to the wall and maintaining situational awareness. 9 o'clock came and went. David sat with his folder balanced on his knee, hands folded to keep them from fidgeting, breathing steady despite his heart's acceleration. Other people moved through the corridor, quick glances in his direction without sustained interest, everyone focused on their own priorities. At 9:07, a man emerged from one of the conference rooms, younger than David by maybe 5 years, wearing a suit that cost more than David had earned in a month before this interview. The man carried himself with the particular ease of someone who'd never doubted he belonged in spaces like this, and he walked past the waiting area without acknowledgement, already pulling out his phone. At 9:13, a woman appeared, early 30s, navy pantsuit, Northwestern tote bag, laptop under one arm. She came from the same conference room, face neutral but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just completed a successful interaction. She made eye contact with David as she passed, offered a professional nod, and headed toward the elevator. David understood what he was seeing. Other candidates, people whose interviews had finished, people who probably fit the job description better than he did. The comparison was inevitable and depressing, each person who emerged another data point suggesting he was outmatched before he'd even entered the room. At 9:17, Linda Taylor appeared in the corridor, moving with the efficient purposefulness of someone running slightly behind schedule. She was maybe 45, black woman in a gray dress and sensible heels, carrying a tablet and looking at it while she walked. "David Martinez?" He stood, folder in hand, and approached. Linda looked up from her tablet and gave him a quick once-over, the assessment professional rather than judgmental. "I'm Linda Taylor, HR. Thanks for coming in. Follow me, please." The conference room was standard corporate issue. Long table, chairs on both sides, whiteboard on one wall, windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. 2 people sat at the far end of the table. Linda took a seat on the left side. The other person, a man David recognized from the executive portraits on the 15th floor, sat at the center position with the authority of someone who owned the space. Richard Thompson, Vice President of Client Relations. 52 years old based on the brief biography David had found online, Yale undergraduate, Harvard MBA, 26 years at Roberts Global. Salt and pepper hair perfectly cut, suit that probably cost what David paid in rent for 3 months, watch that caught the light and refracted it like a small sun on his wrist. Thompson didn't look up when David entered, focused instead on a folder open in front of him, reading something with the kind of attention that suggested this moment, this interview, this candidate didn't warrant interruption of his review. Linda gestured to the chair across from them. "Please, have a seat." David sat, placed his folder on the table, folded his hands in his lap to keep them still. Linda offered a professional smile and launched into an explanation of how the interview would proceed. Standard questions about experience and qualifications, opportunity for David to ask questions at the end, decision timeline within 5 business days. Thompson still hadn't looked up. The first questions came from Linda, safe and predictable. "Why are you interested in this position?" David answered honestly, talking about wanting to contribute more directly to client success, about understanding Roberts Global's operations from a unique perspective, about being ready for new challenges. His voice stayed steady, the rehearsal paying off, the words coming out natural enough to not sound scripted. "What experience do you have in client-facing roles?" David pivoted to his Army logistics work, explained how he'd managed relationships with contractors across cultural and linguistic barriers, how he'd briefed senior officers who needed clear information under pressure, how he'd learned to translate technical complexity into actionable guidance for diverse audiences. Linda nodded along, typing notes on her tablet, her face encouraging without committing to anything. The conversation felt productive, like maybe he had a chance, like his preparation might actually matter. Then Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the particular precision of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. "Mr. Martinez." He still hadn't looked up from the folder, reading David's resume like it was a document requiring scrutiny rather than a person requiring acknowledgement. "Your current role with Roberts Global is listed as facilities maintenance, night shift." The pause that followed had weight, the silence engineered to emphasize the distance between maintenance staff and the position under discussion. Thompson let it sit there, heavy and uncomfortable, before continuing. "That's quite a leap you're attempting here." David kept his breathing even, his hands still, his face neutral. "Yes, sir. I believe my familiarity with this company's operations and culture gives me perspective that's valuable in client relations. Technical skills can be taught. Understanding how an organization truly functions takes time." Thompson set down the folder and finally looked at David, the eye contact deliberate and assessing. His expression revealed nothing, a blank professional mask that could hide either consideration or contempt with equal ease. "There's also a significant gap in your employment history, 3 years from 2018 to 2021. Can you explain that?" "I was primary caregiver for my wife during her terminal illness, then managed the transition to single parenting after her death. That period required crisis management, resourcefulness, and maintaining composure under sustained pressure, all directly applicable to client relations work." Thompson leaned back in his chair, the movement subtle but communicating withdrawal, distance opening up between them that had nothing to do with physical space. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Martinez. I want to be transparent with you as well." The phrasing sounded reasonable, almost kind, but David had learned to read subtext in Iraq when platitudes from local officials preceded roadside bombs. Transparency in this context meant something else entirely. "This position interfaces directly with our premier client accounts, Fortune 500 CEOs, contracts worth $50 to $70 million annually. Our clients expect a certain—" Thompson paused, selecting his next word with visible care. "Polish. A certain background and presentation that reflects well on Roberts Global." Linda Taylor shifted in her seat, her face remaining neutral, but her discomfort bleeding through in the micro-movements David had been trained to observe. "I need to make sure you understand the caliber of individual we typically place in these positions. Candidates with minimum 5 years in client-facing corporate roles, ideally MBA or equivalent, established track record of success at this level." The words landed like precision strikes, each one designed to make David understand his application had been a category error, a misunderstanding of where he fit in the organizational hierarchy. Thompson wasn't saying you're not qualified. He was saying you're not the kind of person we put in front of our clients, and the difference between those statements was everything. David heard it all, understood exactly what Thompson was communicating beneath the professional language. Not just, "You're a janitor," not just, "You lack credentials." Something deeper, something about polish and background and caliber. Coded language that suggested David's presence in front of Fortune 500 CEOs would reflect poorly on Roberts Global for reasons that had nothing to do with his actual competence. He could argue, could explain that his Army logistics experience was exactly the skill set client relations required, that he'd managed more complexity in combat zones than most MBAs handled in climate-controlled conference rooms, that he knew this building and this company better than people who'd worked here 5 years because he'd paid attention while being invisible. But something stopped him, a clarity that cut through the adrenaline and preparation and desperate hope. The room had already decided. Thompson had decided, probably before David walked in, possibly the moment he saw facilities maintenance on the resume. This interview was a formality, a checkbox in a process that led to a predetermined conclusion. Continuing would require David to perform for an audience that had already left, to convince people who'd decided convincing was impossible, to degrade himself trying to prove worth they'd never acknowledge. And he wasn't willing to do that. He'd buried his wife in this suit. He'd submitted this application at 5 in the morning because his 8-year-old son believed he could do anything. He'd stood in his kitchen while Jordan tied his necktie with YouTube tutorial hands. Pure faith radiating from a child who didn't understand the world was designed to say no to people like his father. David had his dignity. It was one of the few things in his life that hadn't cost him anything yet, that didn't require monthly payments or insurance coverage or permission from people who'd already decided he wasn't worth their time. And he could keep it right now by choosing not to beg for consideration from a man who'd made up his mind before the first question. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson." David stood, the movement smooth and unhurried, picking up his folder with steady hands. "Ms. Taylor, I appreciate the opportunity, and I understand the scope of the role clearly." He pushed his chair in, the small gesture of respect that felt important even now, and turned toward the door. Linda Taylor made a sound, surprise or protest, the beginning of a word that didn't finish before David was already moving. "Mr. Martinez, we still have—" "It's all right." He said it gently, without anger or bitterness, just acknowledgement of reality. "Thank you." The door closed behind him with a soft click. David crossed the corridor to the elevator, pressed the call button, and waited. The car arrived empty, the doors opening onto polished interior that reflected his image back at him. Black man in a funeral suit who'd just walked out of a job interview halfway through, choosing dignity over desperation. The lobby appeared through the elevator doors, marble and glass and morning light, people moving through their Thursday with no awareness of what had just collapsed. David walked across the space with his back straight and his face neutral, past the security desk where the guard didn't look up, toward the main entrance and the street beyond. The morning air hit him 50 feet from the building, April warmth cutting through the suit jacket, the city continuing its indifferent progression around him. David walked without destination, putting distance between himself and Roberts Tower, feeling something in his chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite defeat, but occupied the space between them. Then he heard it. Footsteps behind him, quick and purposeful, followed by a voice that carried authority like some people carried car keys. "Mr. Martinez." He turned. Elizabeth Roberts stood 15 feet away, just outside the building's main entrance. No coat despite the breeze, charcoal suit perfect against the backdrop of glass and steel. 59 years old, CEO of a company worth $3.2 billion according to Forbes, standing on a public sidewalk looking at a night janitor who'd just failed an interview with her VP. David recognized her face from the executive portraits he'd cleaned around for 2 years, the same controlled expression that gave nothing away by accident, the kind of deliberate composure that came from having made too many high-stakes decisions to waste energy on unnecessary emotion. "I'd like a few minutes." She said it without preamble, not quite a question but not quite a command, an expectation of reasonableness that assumed he'd agree because refusing made no sense. David stood on Michigan Avenue with nothing left to lose and studied her for a moment, trying to understand what possible reason she could have for following him out here. Then he shrugged, the gesture containing all his exhausted surrender to the day's surreal progression. "All right." Elizabeth didn't move to close the distance between them, just stood where she was and spoke with the same directness she'd probably use in a board meeting. "I was in the building late last Thursday, around 12:30 in the morning. I came down from 15 to the operations office on 8. David knew the route, had mopped that corridor Thursday night after the paramedics left with Robert. "I saw what you did for Robert Harris in the East Corridor. He was having some kind of medical episode. Blood pressure looked like. You kept him alive for 22 minutes until paramedics arrived." She recited it like data, facts delivered without embellishment, and David understood she must have watched security footage, reviewed the incident after the fact, paid attention to something that happened in a part of the building most executives never thought about. "You called it in immediately, kept him calm, monitored his breathing, didn't let him try to stand until professionals arrived. You talked to him the entire time, gentle but firm." Elizabeth paused, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You didn't make it a scene. You didn't wait for someone else. You just handled it." David found his voice trying to match her matter-of-fact delivery. "Robert's a good man. I made sure he didn't fall, that's all. That's exactly what I mean." She said it with something that might have been approval or might have been simple recognition of competence. "What happened in that conference room just now, I'm aware of how those conversations go when Richard Thompson runs them. I'm not going to apologize for a process with a predictable outcome." The honesty startled him. This CEO standing on a sidewalk admitting her own VP had just run a biased interview, stating it plainly without attempting to soften or excuse it. "I'm here because I make decisions about people for a living, Mr. Martinez. What I watched last Thursday told me something about who you are that a resume and a panel interview are very poor at capturing." David looked back at Robert's Tower, the building where he'd just been dismissed, where Thompson's coded language had made clear he didn't have the right polish or background or caliber, the building where apparently someone had been watching after all. He thought about Jordan's letter, still in his jacket pocket, the paper warm against his chest. He thought about the medicine cabinet at home and the inhaler running low. He thought about being 35 years old and still capable of choosing what happened next, even when every choice felt like jumping off a cliff with no certainty about the landing. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Roberts?" She told him, the offer delivered with the same efficiency she'd used for everything else. Client support specialist, reporting directly to her office rather than through Thompson's department. 90-day probation period to prove himself, full benefits package starting day 1, regardless of probation outcome. $78,000 annual salary, nearly triple what he made mopping floors. You'll be working at a level you haven't operated at formally. You'll be proving yourself to people who spent 2 years looking straight through you, including Richard Thompson, whose department you'll be supporting even though you don't report to him. This isn't comfortable, Mr. Martinez, but it's real. David did the math in his head, the calculation instantaneous and brutal. 78,000 divided by 12 months, minus taxes, minus the apartment and utilities and groceries, leaving more than enough for Jordan's medication without having to ration or calculate or decide whether breathing was worth the emergency room bill. The risk was walking back into that building, working alongside Thompson and everyone who'd just witnessed his dismissal, being the CEO's project while having to prove he was more than charity. The reward was an insurance card, doctor appointments without financial terror, Jordan breathing easy. He'd made every decision since Sarah died by asking himself which choice he could still live with at the end of a bad day, when the exhaustion and grief and relentless pressure made everything else fall away. The answer had always been the same: move forward, even when forward was harder, because standing still meant drowning. 90 days. His voice came out steady, surprising him. "I'll take it." Elizabeth gave a single nod, the kind that meant the decision was settled and further discussion was unnecessary. "Come back inside. There's paperwork." David turned and walked back toward the main entrance of Robert's Tower. The building he'd exited 15 minutes ago, convinced he'd failed. Not the service entrance he'd used for 2 years, not the loading dock. The front doors, where people who mattered came and went, where he'd just been told he didn't have the right caliber. He pushed them open and stepped back inside, Elizabeth Roberts beside him, and felt the fundamental equation of his life shift in a way that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The lobby looked the same as it had 20 minutes ago, but David was walking through it differently now, not invisible anymore, not sure if that was better or just more complicated. The paperwork took 90 minutes in a fourth-floor office David had cleaned, but never entered as anything other than maintenance staff. Linda Taylor walked him through the benefits enrollment, salary structure, reporting hierarchy, each form another small confirmation that this was actually happening. His new position sat in an organizational chart category the building hadn't quite figured out how to classify yet, a direct report to the CEO office that existed outside normal departmental structures. He signed where indicated, initialing boxes that acknowledged he understood the probationary terms, that he could be terminated within 90 days without cause, that benefits would activate regardless of employment outcome. That last clause felt like a lifeboat. Insurance coverage locked in, even if he failed. Jordan's medication secured, even if David proved Thompson right about not having the caliber for this work. Monday morning arrived faster than he was ready for, the weekend compressed into a blur of preparation and second-guessing. David bought 2 dress shirts from Target's clearance rack, both white because they were safest, spent money he didn't have on the bet that he'd need them long enough to justify the cost. He showed up at Roberts Tower at 7:55, early enough to demonstrate commitment without looking desperate, and rode the main elevator to the 11th floor for the first time. The floor opened into an open-plan office space, desks arranged in clusters that suggested team structure without the rigid cubicle walls of older corporate design. 9 people worked here according to the org chart Linda had shown him. 6 account managers, 2 senior liaisons, 1 supervisor. David was the 10th, the addition nobody had asked for. The CEO's project dropped into a functional team. His desk occupied the corner nearest the windows, already set up with a laptop docked to 2 monitors, a phone with an extension card beside it, a nameplate that read, David Martinez, Client Support Specialist, in clean sans serif font. The equipment was identical to what everyone else had, no distinction marking him as different, but the location told its own story. Corner desk, maximum visibility, impossible to ignore. Kenneth Walker approached before David had finished logging into the computer. The supervisor was 46, white man going soft around the middle, 20 years at Roberts Global, written in the comfortable efficiency of someone who'd mastered his domain and saw no reason to expand it. His handshake was firm but brief. Professional courtesy extended at minimum viable intensity. Martinez, welcome to Client Services. I'll have your initial assignments by 10. The voice carried no warmth, no hostility, just flat acknowledgement of a situation Walker hadn't chosen and couldn't prevent. David thanked him and watched the supervisor return to his own desk, already moving on to more important concerns. The other 8 members of the team maintained polite distance, the kind of awareness that came from knowing someone new had joined without being quite ready to engage. David logged into his systems, reviewed the access permissions Linda had set up, and tried to project competence while having no clear idea what he was supposed to be doing yet. The assignments arrived at 10:07 via email from Walker, 3 low-priority accounts, mostly data entry and email responses, the kind of work that kept junior staff busy without giving them access to anything that mattered. David read through the account files, familiarized himself with the client histories, and started working through the backlog of minor requests that had accumulated. By noon, he understood the strategy. Walker had given him make work, tasks that needed doing but carried no real stakes, keeping him occupied and out of the way while the actual business of client relations happened around him. It was professional hazing disguised as appropriate onboarding, a test to see if he'd complain or quit or prove himself incapable of even simple assignments. David completed every task, responded to every email within 30 minutes, produced documentation that required no revision. He controlled what he could control, which was the quality of his work, even when the work itself felt designed to be beneath anyone with actual competence. Lunch happened alone at his desk, a sandwich from the bodega near his apartment that cost half what the building's cafeteria charged. Other team members went out together or ate in the break room, conversations happening in clusters that didn't include him. The isolation was deliberate but unstated, a social boundary drawn by people who hadn't decided yet whether he belonged. The afternoon brought more of the same routine tasks that David handled with the focus he'd applied to logistics work in Iraq when the stakes were supply chains that kept soldiers alive. These stakes were lower, but the discipline was identical. Do the work correctly, document everything, build a track record that couldn't be dismissed. At 3:30, Richard Thompson walked through the floor on his way to somewhere else, and the temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. He didn't stop, didn't look at David, just continued his transit with the focused indifference of someone moving through space that happened to contain furniture and equipment and employees he had no particular reason to notice. But David saw the moment Thompson's peripheral vision registered his presence, the fractional hesitation in the VP's stride, the micro-expression that suggested surprise and something darker before professional neutrality reasserted control. Then Thompson was past, disappearing into a conference room, leaving behind the awareness that they'd both acknowledged what hadn't been spoken. Week 1 became week 2, the days accumulating into a pattern that felt sustainable but not comfortable. Walker continued assigning low-priority work. The team continued maintaining polite distance. David continued completing every task perfectly, building a foundation of competence even if nobody seemed particularly interested in noticing. The first crack in the wall came from Jennifer Moore, junior account manager, 28 years old and 18 months into a job that still felt too big for her experience level. She stopped by David's desk on a Thursday afternoon, third week, holding a printed client summary with visible frustration. "Do you have a second?" David looked up from the email he was drafting. "Sure, what's up?" "I saw one of your client summaries in the shared drive. The way you formatted the executive overview, it's cleaner than our template. Could you show me how you structured it?" The request was small, almost meaningless, but it represented the first time anyone on the team had acknowledged his work as something worth learning from. David walked her through his formatting approach, explained the logic behind leading with financial impact before operational details, showed her the conditional formatting he'd applied to make key metrics stand out. Jennifer took notes, asked follow-up questions, thanked him genuinely. "This is really helpful. The template we use is kind of a mess. Happy to help." She returned to her desk and David went back to his email, but something had shifted microscopically. One person had looked at his work and seen value rather than just seeing him. Week 4 brought the first direct encounter with Thompson outside the conference room. David was waiting for an elevator at end of day when the doors opened to reveal the VP inside, alone, checking his phone. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Thompson looked back at his screen, the dismissal absolute. David stepped into the elevator anyway, pressed the button for the lobby, and stood on the opposite side of the car. 40 seconds of descent stretched into something longer, silence loaded with everything neither of them would say. Thompson's reflection appeared in the polished doors, face composed, attention apparently absorbed by whatever was on his phone. The elevator stopped at 7, 2 people getting on, corporate refugees heading home, their presence diffusing the tension without eliminating it. They reached the lobby, the doors opened. Thompson exited first without acknowledgement, disappearing into the evening foot traffic. David rode the bus home and tried not to calculate how many more encounters like that lay ahead, how many times he'd have to exist in spaces with people who'd decided his presence was a mistake they were too professional to address directly. Jordan asked about the new job every night at dinner, questions that started specific and became more general as he realized his father's answers were variations on, "It's fine, buddy." The kid watched him with concern that aged him beyond 8 years. and David tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. The medicine cabinet had changed, though. The insurance card sat in David's wallet now, laminated proof that Jordan's next prescription would cost $15 instead of $385. He'd scheduled the appointment with the pulmonologist they'd postponed 4 times, gotten Jordan on a new medication protocol that was already reducing the frequency of bad breathing days. That was the victory he held on to during the long afternoons of low-priority work and careful isolation. Not the job itself, which felt precarious and uncomfortable, but what the job enabled. Jordan breathing easier. Doctor appointments without terror. The fundamental equation of survival shifting from impossible to merely difficult. Week 5 started with an emergency that David only understood was happening when Kenneth Walker appeared at his desk Tuesday morning, face tight with stress that didn't match his usual composed efficiency. "Martinez, how much do you actually know about the Apex manufacturing account?" David's mind shifted gears, pulling up the file he'd reviewed during week 2 when he'd used downtime to study every major client account in the system. Apex Manufacturing, $47 million contract, 11 years with Roberts Global, CEO named Stephen Clark, who'd built a regional logistics company into a national operation through aggressive acquisition and operational efficiency. "I've reviewed the full account history. Why?" Walker exhaled, the sound carrying more weight than the breath itself. "Brian Anderson handles Apex. His mother had a stroke last night. He's on a plane to Seattle right now, completely unreachable. Stephen Clark called the main line 30 minutes ago, furious about an $89,000 billing discrepancy across 4 quarters. He's threatening to invoke the exit clause in his contract and pull the entire account by Friday end of business if we don't resolve it." David absorbed the information, his mind already moving to problem-solving mode, the instincts from logistics work in Iraq activating before conscious thought caught up. "What do we know about the discrepancy?" "Nothing yet. Anderson's files are on the shared drive, but they're complex as hell. 11 years of rate structures and service tiers. The 2 senior liaisons are both at an off-site conference in Boston. Thompson's in meetings all morning." Walker's face did something complicated, frustration and desperation fighting for dominance. "You said you reviewed the account?" 3 weeks ago. I've gone through Q3 2022 forward, studied the billing model, cross-referenced the service agreements." Walker stared at him, trying to determine if this was competence or bravado, whether the janitor-turned-specialist actually understood what he was claiming. "Clark wants a callback in 45 minutes. Either you take it or I have to tell a $47 million client we're not prepared to address his concerns." David pulled up the Apex files on his screen, opening multiple windows simultaneously, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. "I'll take it. I need 30 minutes to analyze the discrepancy, then I'll call him." Walker nodded, relief and skepticism mixing in his expression, and walked away without another word. David heard the supervisor's voice from across the floor, quiet conversation with someone, probably explaining that the new guy was handling Apex, preparing for either success or spectacular failure. The account files opened across both monitors, quarterly billing statements and service agreements and rate schedules layered in the particular complexity that came from organic business growth over time. David narrowed his focus, looking for the pattern that would explain an $89,000 overcharge, the systematic error that would compound across multiple quarters. He found it in 18 minutes. April 2022, Apex had upgraded from standard to premium service tier, the change implemented correctly in the primary billing system. But the legacy supplemental fees from their 2019 rate structure had never been disabled, the system applying both new premium charges and old standard surcharges to the same services. The error had cascaded forward for 4 quarters, a double billing on freight coordination that should have been caught in routine review but had slipped through because quarterly audits focused on new charges rather than legacy fee structures. David pulled the relevant documentation, built a timeline of when the error started and how it had compounded, calculated the exact credit amount, and drafted a remediation plan that included process changes to prevent recurrence. 28 minutes since Walker had given him the assignment. His Army experience gave him an advantage here. The pattern recognition from managing supply chains, where billing errors could mean the difference between mission success and soldiers going without critical equipment. He'd learned to see the systems beneath the transactions, to identify where processes broke down, to fix problems while preventing future iterations. At precisely 43 minutes, David picked up his phone and dialed the number Walker had forwarded. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered, professional efficiency with an edge of protectiveness. "Mr. Clark's office. This is David Martinez from Roberts Global Client Support. Mr. Clark requested a call back regarding the Apex account billing issue. I'm prepared to address his concerns." A pause, muffled conversation in the background, then a different voice came on the line. Male, late 50s, based on the timbre, authority embedded in every syllable. "This is Stephen Clark. Who are you and where's Brian Anderson?" David kept his voice steady, information delivered in the clipped cadence he'd used for casualty reports when emotions were liability. "I'm David Martinez, client support specialist. Brian Anderson had a family emergency and is currently unavailable. I've reviewed your account in detail and identified the source of the billing discrepancy. I'm ready to walk you through what happened and how we'll resolve it. You have 30 seconds to convince me this conversation is worth continuing. April 2022, Apex upgraded to premium service tier. The system correctly applied new rates but failed to disable legacy supplemental fees from your 2019 rate structure. You've been double charged on freight coordination for 4 consecutive quarters. Total overcharge is $89,400. We'll process a credit within 36 hours and implement quarterly legacy fee audits to prevent recurrence." Silence on the other end, the kind that meant Clark was processing, verifying David's summary against his own understanding. "You figured that out in 45 minutes? 30. I've studied your account history as part of my onboarding. I recognized the pattern immediately." "And you are?" "Client support specialist. 8 years, Army logistics, supply chain management and combat zones. I understand complex billing structures." Another pause, shorter this time. "Walk me through the mechanism. How exactly did this happen?" David explained, using terminology from Apex's own service agreements, referencing specific line items by quarter and service code, speaking the language of someone who'd actually read the documentation rather than just skimmed it. He didn't apologize abstractly for the error. He apologized specifically for the failure to catch it during routine review, named the breakdown in their audit process, and outlined the correction protocol. Clark's voice shifted during the explanation, the anger cooling into something more professional, the tone of someone who'd expected excuses and was getting competence instead. "Brian never mentioned you. I'm new to the team. This is my 5th week. But you knew my account well enough to diagnose a 4-quarter billing error in half an hour. I made it my business to understand our major clients regardless of my current assignments." Clark was quiet for a moment, and David could hear papers rustling, probably the billing statements Clark had been reviewing when he'd called to threaten contract termination. "Send me the detailed reconciliation by end of day. Include your process improvement proposal. I'll hold the contract review pending resolution, but I want you as my point of contact going forward. You'll have the documentation by 4 p.m., Mr. Clark, and I'm available whenever you need." The call ended, and David set down the phone to find Kenneth Walker standing 3 feet away, face cycling through emotions too complex to parse completely. The supervisor had obviously been listening, along with half the floor based on the ambient silence that suggested work had paused in favor of eavesdropping. "That was good work, Martinez." Walker said it quietly, the words carrying more weight for their restraint, coming from a man who'd spent 5 weeks assigning him make work. David nodded and turned back to his computer, pulling up the template for formal reconciliation memos. He had 6 hours to produce documentation that would satisfy a CEO who'd just threatened to pull a $47 million account, and the adrenaline was already fading into focus. The memo took 90 minutes to write, another 30 for compliance review, final approval from Walker at 3:40. David sent it to Stephen Clark at 3:47, 13 minutes early, and immediately started drafting the process improvement proposal that would prevent similar errors across all client accounts. At 4:15, his phone rang. David glanced at the caller ID, expecting Clark's office, and found instead Jordan's school. His stomach dropped before his conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from every previous call that had started this way and ended with emergency rooms. Mr. Martinez, this is Nurse Patterson at Lincoln Elementary. Jordan had a severe asthma episode during recess. We administered his rescue inhaler, but his breathing didn't improve adequately. We've called 911. Paramedics are transporting him to Northwestern Memorial. The world compressed to a pinpoint, everything outside that single piece of information becoming irrelevant. David was already standing, already grabbing his jacket, his voice somehow staying level despite his heart trying to escape his chest. I'm on my way. How bad? He's conscious and responding, but in significant distress. The paramedic said it's precautionary but necessary. David ended the call and turned to find Walker watching him, the supervisor's face showing concern that looked genuine. Family emergency. My son. Hospital. Go. Now. The elevator took too long. The lobby stretched too far. The street outside was chaos and noise and obstacles between him and Northwestern Memorial. David ran, jacket flapping, dress shoes not designed for sprinting, covering the 8 blocks in a blur of intersections and pedestrians and his own ragged breathing. The emergency room entrance swallowed him into fluorescent brightness and antiseptic smell. The admissions desk staffed by a woman who'd seen too many panicked parents to be moved by another one. She checked her computer when David gave Jordan's name, directed him to Bay 7, told him to check in with the attending physician. Bay 7 had curtains for walls and medical equipment that beeped with rhythms David didn't understand. Jordan lay on a gurney, oxygen mask covering his face, eyes wide and frightened, chest rising and falling in the labored pattern David had learned to recognize as dangerous. An IV ran into his left arm. Monitors tracked numbers that David tried to interpret through the fog of terror. He moved to the bedside, taking Jordan's right hand, feeling the small fingers grip his with desperate strength. I'm here, buddy. I'm here. Jordan tried to talk through the mask, words muffled and unclear, eyes communicating what his voice couldn't. David stroked his son's hair, keeping his own breathing steady even though his hands wanted to shake, maintaining the calm Jordan needed even as his mind calculated worst-case scenarios. A doctor appeared, young woman with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone trained to deliver information quickly. Mr. Martinez, I'm Dr. Patel. Jordan's having a severe bronchospasm. We've started a nebulizer treatment and corticosteroids. He should improve within the next hour or two, but we'll keep him for observation overnight. How bad is it? Serious but manageable. His oxygen saturation is improving. We'll monitor him closely, but I expect full recovery. David heard the words, processed the prognosis, felt some of the terror ease into mere fear. What's the cost? I mean, overnight observation. How much? Dr. Patel checked the tablet she carried, pulling up his information. You have Roberts Global Insurance. Your copay is $50. Everything else is covered. The number landed differently than it would have 2 months ago. $50 instead of $50,000. Overnight observation without having to choose between Jordan's breathing and next month's rent. The insurance card in David's wallet, tangible proof that this crisis was medical rather than financial. Thank you. The doctor nodded and moved to check Jordan's vitals, adjusting something on the IV, speaking to the kid in the reassuring tone healthcare professionals learn to deploy with frightened children. Jordan's breathing was already easing slightly, the medication taking effect, panic receding as oxygen became less scarce. David pulled the visitor chair close to the gurney and sat, maintaining contact with Jordan's hand, anchoring them both. Time became fluid, marked by monitor beeps and shift changes and gradual improvement in his son's breathing. Jordan dozed intermittently, exhaustion winning out over fear, while David sat vigil and tried not to think about what would have happened if this had occurred 3 months ago. At 7:30, his phone buzzed. Text from Kenneth Walker. Hope your son is okay. Apex proposal can wait. Take care of him. David typed a reply one-handed, not willing to let go of Jordan. He's stable. Thanks. Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. This is Jennifer Moore. Let me know if you need anything. We're thinking about you. The unexpected kindness hit harder than it should have, evidence that some walls were more permeable than others, that 5 weeks of perfect work had registered with at least a few people. Jordan stirred, pulling off the oxygen mask now that his breathing had improved enough to make it unnecessary. His voice came out rough but clearer than before. "Dad, did I mess up your work?" David felt something crack in his chest, the question revealing what an 8-year-old carried when he understood his medical needs created problems for his father. "No, buddy, you didn't mess up anything. You're my work. You're everything that matters. I tried to breathe quiet like you taught me. But it didn't work this time. You did everything right. Sometimes your body just needs extra help, and that's okay. That's what doctors are for." Jordan's fingers tightened around his. "Are we going to be okay? With the hospital and stuff?" "We have insurance now, remember? From my new job. This visit costs $50. That's it." Jordan absorbed this, his 8-year-old brain trying to understand what $50 meant versus the anxiety he'd learned to associate with medical care. "That's not a lot. That's not a lot," David confirmed, stroking his son's hair, feeling the kid's breathing continue to ease toward normal. They kept Jordan overnight as promised, David sleeping in the chair beside the gurney, waking every hour when nurses came to check vitals. By morning, Jordan was breathing easily, chatting with the breakfast delivery person about dinosaurs, acting like a healthy kid rather than someone who'd been in respiratory distress 12 hours earlier. Dr. Patel discharged them at 9, new medication protocol in hand, instructions for follow-up with Jordan's pulmonologist within the week. David carried the paperwork and held Jordan's hand and walked out of Northwestern Memorial feeling like he'd survived something that would have destroyed them 6 weeks ago. The bus ride home happened in morning sunshine. Jordan pressed against his side, both of them exhausted but okay. Mrs. Chen met them at the apartment, having been texted updates throughout the night, and immediately took charge of getting Jordan settled while David dealt with the practical aftermath. He called Kenneth Walker from the apartment, expecting to have to explain his absence, prepared to grovel if necessary. "How's your son?" Walker's voice carried genuine concern rather than professional obligation. "Better. Discharged this morning. I can be in this afternoon." "Don't. Take the day. Take tomorrow if you need it. The Apex situation is handled." "Handled how?" "I used your notes, finished the proposal, sent it to Clark. He accepted it this morning and extended Apex's contract for 3 years. Total value $141 million. David sat at his kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, trying to process what Walker had just said. $141 million. 3 years. Extended contract. "I didn't do that much. You solved a crisis in 30 minutes that could have cost us the account. You knew the client history better than people who've worked here 5 years. That's worth acknowledging." Walker paused. "Also, for what it's worth, you were right to go to your kid. Some things matter more than work." The call ended, leaving David staring at his phone in the mid-morning quiet, Jordan's breathing audible from the next room, steady and unlabored. Week 7 brought changes that felt seismic but presented themselves quietly. An email from Elizabeth Roberts' office summoning him to the 15th floor, an appointment time with no context. Her corner office overlooked Lake Michigan, windows spanning floor to ceiling, the view so expansive it made David understand why people fought to occupy spaces like this. Elizabeth sat behind a desk that probably cost more than his annual salary before the promotion, reading something on her computer, gesturing for him to sit without looking up. He waited, hands folded, until she finished whatever had her attention and turned to face him directly. "Your 90-day probation ends next Tuesday. I'm making your position permanent, effective immediately. Salary increases to $92,000 to reflect full-grade compensation." She delivered it without ceremony. stating facts rather than offering congratulations. Stephen Clark specifically requested you continue as his primary contact. He said you know his account better than anyone at Roberts Global, including Brian Anderson. David nodded, trying to keep his face neutral, not sure how to respond to praise delivered with the emotional temperature of quarterly earnings data. I'm also creating a new position, VP of Client Operations. I want you to build a team focused on preventing the kind of systemic failures that almost cost us Apex. You'll need to hire 2 analysts and a coordinator, develop audit protocols, implement them across our client portfolio. The job description landed like a physical weight, responsibility David had never imagined occupying, authority that seemed disconnected from who he'd been 2 months ago. Ms. Roberts, I appreciate the confidence, but nothing. You saw a problem others missed because you actually paid attention to how our systems work. That's the skill set I need in this role. She leaned back in her chair, expression unchanged. You'll report directly to me. Richard Thompson will be informed this afternoon. The mention of Thompson hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of the dynamic that had defined David's entire experience on the 11th floor. He won't like it. He doesn't have to like it. He has to accept it. Elizabeth's face showed the first hint of something beyond professional neutrality, a glimpse of steel underneath the composure. I don't make business decisions based on who likes them. I make them based on who delivers results. The meeting lasted another 10 minutes, logistics and timeline and salary details that David absorbed while still processing the fundamental shift in his trajectory. He walked out of the 15th floor and took the elevator down to 11, where his desk and his low-priority assignments and his careful isolation waited, except they didn't, not anymore. Jennifer Moore was at his desk when he arrived, along with 2 other account managers he'd barely spoken to, all 3 looking at him with expressions that suggested news had traveled faster than the elevator. Is it true? VP of Client Operations? David nodded, still not quite believing it himself. That's amazing. Congratulations. Jennifer's enthusiasm seemed genuine, uncomplicated by the politics that made everything else at Roberts Global feel loaded. The afternoon brought an email to the entire Client Services Department, Elizabeth Roberts announcing the new VP position and David's appointment to it, effective immediately. The message was brief, professional, and absolutely unambiguous about reporting structure and authority. Richard Thompson appeared on the floor 30 minutes later, and the room's temperature dropped the way it always did when the VP entered their space. He walked directly to Kenneth Walker's desk, had a brief conversation David couldn't hear, then turned and left without looking in David's direction. Walker approached afterward, face carefully neutral. Thompson wants to see you in his office. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. The summons felt inevitable, the conversation David had been avoiding since that first interview finally demanding to happen. He spent the evening with Jordan, helping with homework and making dinner, and trying not to think about what Thompson would say, how he'd frame his objection to David's promotion, whether this was the beginning of a longer conflict. Thursday morning, David arrived at Thompson's office at 8:58. The VP's assistant, a woman in her 60s with the protective efficiency of someone who'd gate-kept for decades, told him to wait. 9 o'clock became 9:15, the delay obviously deliberate, a small power play to remind David of the hierarchy even as it shifted beneath them. At 9:20, the office door opened and Thompson appeared, gesturing David inside without greeting. The space was exactly what David expected. Expensive furniture, framed degrees from Yale and Harvard, photographs of Thompson with various business leaders and politicians, the accumulated evidence of a career built on connections and credentials. Thompson sat behind his desk and studied David for a long moment, face revealing nothing. Then he spoke, voice carrying the same precision from the interview, but none of the coded dismissal. Congratulations on the Apex account, Martinez. That was exceptional work. The words sounded genuine, or at least professionally delivered, but David waited for the other half of the statement, the qualification that would undermine the praise. It didn't come. Instead, Thompson leaned forward slightly, hands folded on his desk. I misjudged you. During your interview, I made assumptions based on incomplete information and personal bias. That was unprofessional, and I apologize. David sat very still, trying to process an apology he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he trusted. Elizabeth is right to promote you. You've demonstrated capabilities that our hiring process failed to identify. I want you to know that you have my full support in your new role. The apology was careful, constructed, the kind of statement someone made when their CEO had made clear that support wasn't optional. But it was still an apology, an acknowledgement of the coded language and assumptions that had defined their first interaction. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate that. They talked for another 10 minutes, discussing how the new VP role would interface with existing client services operations, where authorities would overlap and where they'd remain separate. Thompson was professional throughout, the conversation functional rather than warm, but devoid of the hostility David had braced for. Walking out of that office, David felt something shift that he couldn't quite name. Not victory, because Thompson's apology didn't erase the original dismissal. Not vindication, because proving himself shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. Something else, something about choosing to move forward rather than remaining anchored to the moment when he'd walked out of an interview that had already decided against him. The elevator arrived, doors opening onto an empty car. David stepped inside and pressed 11, watching his reflection in the polished doors. Black man, 35, wearing a suit that fit better now that he could afford tailoring, carrying a job title that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Jordan's breathing had improved steadily over the weeks since the hospitalization, the new medication protocol working better than anything they'd tried before. His pulmonologist had been impressed at the follow-up appointment, noting the reduced inflammation and better overall control. The bad days were becoming rare rather than routine. David got home by 5:30 now, daylight still in the sky, time enough to actually be present for homework and dinner and the evening routines that built a life rather than just surviving one. They sat at the kitchen table Friday night, Jordan working on a science project about the solar system, while David reviewed the job descriptions he needed to write for his new team. Dad? Jordan looked up from his construction paper planets, scissors in hand. Mrs. Chen said you got promoted again. Yeah, buddy. Bigger job, more responsibility. Does that mean you're important now? David set down his pen and looked at his son, the question containing more weight than an 8-year-old probably intended. I'm not more important than I was when I was cleaning floors. The job changed, but I'm the same person. Jordan considered this, his face serious in the way kids got when processing concepts that didn't quite fit their existing framework. But people treat you different now. Some people do. Is that good or bad? David thought about Thompson's apology, about Walker's support during the hospital crisis, about Jennifer Moore asking to learn his formatting approach. He thought about the 2 years of invisibility that had preceded all of it, the way he'd moved through the building like furniture people walked around without registering. It's complicated, buddy. People seeing you is better than people ignoring you, but the best thing is when people see you for who you actually are, not just for what job you have. Jordan nodded, accepting this wisdom even if he didn't fully understand it yet, and went back to cutting out Saturn's rings with careful concentration. David's phone buzzed with an email from Elizabeth Roberts, subject line reading simply, Monday. He opened it to find a meeting invitation, her office, 8 a.m., agenda listed as Team Building and Q4 Planning. He responded with confirmation and set the phone down, looking around the apartment that had felt like a trap 3 months ago and now felt like something else. Still small, still shabby around the edges, but no longer suffocating. The medicine cabinet held Jordan's new prescription, the one that cost $12 instead of $385. The refrigerator had actual food instead of strategic rationing. The mailbox still collected bills, but they were manageable now, problems with solutions rather than disasters waiting to happen. Jordan's letter was framed on the wall now, the original note with its careful handwriting and stick figure drawing, mounted in a simple black frame David had bought at Target. He looked at it sometimes, reminded himself of the faith an 8-year-old had offered when his father had forgotten how to believe in forward motion. "If you want to try something new, I believe you can do it." The words hadn't changed anything on their own. David had changed things, submitting the application and surviving the interview and walking out with his dignity intact and then walking back in when someone finally offered a real chance. But the words had gotten him to take the first step, and sometimes that was all anyone needed. Permission to try, offered by someone who loved them enough to believe before evidence existed. Saturday morning brought the first genuinely free day David had experienced in years. No shift to sleep through, no crisis demanding immediate attention, just open hours he could fill however he chose. He took Jordan to the Museum of Science and Industry, something they'd talked about doing but never had the combination of time and money to execute. They spent 4 hours wandering exhibits, Jordan's excitement at the space exploration displays making David's chest ache with the particular pain that came from realizing how much his son had been quietly sacrificing to make his father's impossible situation slightly less impossible. The kid deserved this, deserved more than this, deserved a life where museums and new shoes and breathing easy were normal rather than occasional luxuries. On the bus ride home, Jordan fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted from the day's adventures, and David held him carefully while Chicago rolled past the windows. The city looked different now, or maybe David was looking at it differently, seeing possibility instead of just obstacle, future instead of just present. He thought about Robert Harris, the security guard he'd helped that night on the 8th floor, the moment that had changed everything without him knowing it was being watched. Robert had returned to work 3 weeks after his hospital stay, had found David during a late evening when he was working past normal hours, and thanked him with the gravity of someone who understood they'd been given extra time. "You saved my life, son." Robert had said it simply, no dramatics, just fact. "I won't forget that." David had deflected, uncomfortable with the weight of the statement, but Robert had persisted. "No, you need to hear this. You didn't hesitate. You didn't wait for someone more qualified. You just did what needed doing. That's who you are." The words echoed now, mixing with Jordan's letter and Elizabeth's offer and Thompson's apology and all the other moments that had accumulated into a trajectory David still couldn't quite believe was real. He wasn't special, wasn't exceptionally talented, wasn't chosen by fate for anything. He was just someone who'd kept working when work felt pointless, who'd helped someone when helping was just the obvious thing to do, who'd taken a chance when taking chances seemed like the fastest route to confirming he should have stayed invisible. Monday morning arrived, and David rode the elevator to 15, carrying the job descriptions he'd drafted over the weekend. Elizabeth's office looked the same as it had during his last visit, the view still spectacular, the desk still imposing. But he walked into it differently now, not as someone waiting to be dismissed or rescued, just as someone with work to do and the authority to do it. Elizabeth reviewed his hiring plans, asked sharp questions that tested his thinking, approved his budget without modification, and told him to start recruiting immediately. One more thing. She pulled up something on her computer, turned the screen so David could see. A press release, scheduled for Wednesday publication, announcing the creation of Roberts Global's new Client Operations Division and introducing David Martinez as Vice President. His name in print, his title official, his photograph from the company directory looking back at him with an expression that suggested he'd been caught mid-thought rather than posing deliberately. Any concerns about public announcement? David thought about it, about having his name and face attached to this role, about the scrutiny that would come with visibility, about the people from his past who might see it and wonder how a janitor became an executive. No concerns. He walked out of Elizabeth Roberts's office and took the elevator down to 11, where his corner desk and his expanding responsibilities and his future waited. The floors passed in smooth succession, the building's geography familiar now in a way that had nothing to do with knowing which supply closets held light bulbs. The doors opened onto his floor, and David stepped out into a space where people knew his name, where his work mattered, where he'd built something real from the scraps of what had been burned down. Jordan was breathing easy. The bills were paid. The medicine cabinet wasn't a source of nightly terror. He'd moved forward, even when forward was harder than standing still, even when everyone told him the distance was too far to cross. He hadn't changed, not fundamentally. The world had just finally caught up to who he'd been all along.